Welcome to Chapter 5, everyone, and we are going to be going over the physical and cognitive development of childhood and the social-emotional development later on, too. This is the first of 3 presentations. This one will be, I think, the longest one. This one has 18 slides, I believe. I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible. So without any further ado, let's begin our live lesson. Feel free to just listen along, or you can watch the slides as we go through these. So what sets us apart from other animals or other species? Well, if we look at human socialization, we can learn how to norm to particular cultures. We also have the ability to take on another person's perspective. And one of the biggest things that sets us apart is we are able to learn a particular language and to be able to vocalize. Even though we know that other species do communicate, they do not have the ability to learn language like human beings do. So we're going to look at how all of these things integrate into development. We are also going to look at the influencing factors of healthy development. So let's take a look at the slide here that shows our brain development differentiated from different species. And so if we look at compared to other parts of the brain, the frontal lobe development is on a delayed timetable. And remember, we talked about the frontal lobe being part of the decision making or the planning and how we act and react to things. And we also talked about last week about how the brain is kind of like a tree growing, that it just kind of goes from the trunk out to the branches, and then some leaves come, and then more and more and more until we have this really beautiful, full-looking tree. So when we move from reacting to being able to regulate ourselves, this really has a lot to do with how our brain is developing and how we're reacting to our world and how we're starting to understand the world. So it's also, when we talk about the brain growth, is being able to use those higher processing skills. So if you look at how maybe a 1 or 2-year-old might think or react, as opposed to how a 10 or 11-year-old might react to something, it's a lot different. And most of that is just really due to the fact that the brain is starting to learn how to process things from a very concrete way, maybe one-dimensional way of looking at things, to a very multi-dimensional way of looking at things. So during this time period, we are also looking at the physical development. And if we go back to last week and we talk about the cephalococcygeal sequence, that really is looking at now the baby has the ability to raise its head, then the ability to move its trunk, and then all of a sudden, they realize that they have these arms and these hands for wonderful things so that they can grab everything within their reach. And then all of a sudden they're able to walk and use their legs. So now we have the bodies elongating and lengthening. And then we also have that part of physical development from mass to specific, where the abilities become more coordinated and more precise. And so 2 of these physical skills include the gross motor skills and the fine motor skills. Now when we look at the gross motor skills, that's really talking about the large muscle movements. And then when we go down to the fine motor skills, it's more of the fine coordination movement, maybe of the fingers, of the toes, of being able to do fine detail things. So which one do you think comes in first? The gross motor skills or the fine motor skills? Well, if you thought that it was the gross motor skills, you'd be correct. And one of the ways that you can look at the gross motor skills is that if you've ever seen a baby that has just learned how to walk, they kind of do that monster walk thing because they're not bending their knees as much, and so their legs really are quite rigid, and they kind of look like little monsters walking. So just kind of a little example there for you. And so what can we expect at these different ages? So we've already looked at the infants, and we've talked about the brain development and how they're starting to recognize mom and dad and faces and all of these other things going on, and how they use their toys to kind of compare and contrast, and maybe different surfaces mean different things to them by grabbing them, and then they squeak, or that they feel very rough. And so they're starting to experience their world now, going from that sensory area kind of into more of integrating all of this information. So at age 2, when we look at the physical development, that they're able to pick things up with their thumbs and their forefingers. They might be able to feed themselves with a spoon in some sense. And they can walk unassisted, usually by about 12 months. Again, we have to take that into context of each child's development. Children that are maybe born larger or that develop a lot quicker and their body weight is a little bit heavier, they might not walk until maybe 14 or even 16 months, because really their muscles have to be able to support the extra weight. So then we also look at this age that the baby might roll a ball or fling it awkwardly at you. And then when they get to about age 4, they're starting to use those fine motor skills and use those plastic scissors at school. They can walk down the stairs using alternating feet, rather than, you know, how some of them either kind of slide down the stairs or they turn backwards and kind of crawl down the stairs. And they might be able to catch and control a large bounce ball. And then at age 5, that they start using those fine motor skills to print their name, and they walk without holding onto a railing, which we never want to tell them that that's okay. And then they're able to toss a ball overhand with the bent elbows. And then age 6, they start to copy 2 or even 3 words. They're able to hop on one foot and then the other, holding onto a rail. They catch and control a 10-inch ball with their hands or their arms out in front of them. So we see all these different things coming into play here. And the other thing is that we've already talked about the practice, and you guys who took on the experiment of going out and looking at these different toys, is you can see how we might think, well, you know, just because this toy, they pull on it and it goes back, that, you know, it's interesting for them, I don't get it. But for them, they're starting to develop a sense of what is stretchy mean? What happens when you pull something and then, you know, you let a rubber band go, you know, that hurts. So they're starting to experience their world in many different ways. The other thing for practice is that there's a lot of things where you guys might have old shampoo bottles or something, and you think, oh, I'm just going to throw them away. It could be an old orange juice bottle. And if you keep these things with the larger lids, not the ones that they can put in their mouth and try to eat, but the larger lids, is that you rinse them out and you put the bottles in front of them and tell them to take the lids off. So taking lids off and on is developing those fine motor skills. So all of these things that we see, like for play, maybe in a child care center, or that you buy for toys for your kids, all of these things are very important to their growth and their fine motor skill development. All right, so let's go on, and we're going to talk a little bit about what the threats are to these growth and motor skill development too. So all of these things are related to what we would consider, and I say quote unquote, the normal growth, because we always have to remember that's a little bit of a sliding scale. Every child is different. So what we should be seeing, this is really kind of within maybe a certain parameter, a certain time frame, what we should be seeing. So there's different factors that threaten these development and the growth, and so let's take a look at a few of those. And so the reason that, you know, we say that we should be seeing these things is because we want to understand that if there is something going wrong, or we do see something, is that, you know, maybe we can relate it to, you know, what's going on with the child? Why do they seem this way? Or maybe why are they not developing? And so a lot of times we can start relating it to particular factors that are influencing growth. And the first one that we're going to talk about is nutrition. So as we've already talked about this last week, is that this is the #1 threat to development is malnutrition. So the inadequate nutrition is the top ranking 25th century global public health threat to physical development. And this is a little list of things that it can affect. Stunting, where we see that the growth is stunted, and this can be that the child does not grow physically in many ways, not just talking about the height. And So how does that happen? Maybe the child isn't getting the right vitamins, isn't getting the right nutrients. And so what's happening is instead of developing and instead of growing like that beautiful, wonderful tree that we talked about, is that all the body is doing is trying to maintain and stay alive. So it's not able to venture out and to support other growth elements. And so then we also talked about, whether the woman decides to breastfeed or decides to use, formula, is that this all is associated with bone, muscle, and brain development. The fats in the milk help brain development. Then we also have calcium, and we have also a lot of other things that support the bone growth and muscle growth. And so, one of the other things that we might look at as either an outsider or even a care provider, or for those who go on to become child psychologists or social workers, is that if we have a child that is rather lethargic, we want to understand why is that. And sometimes there's hidden causes. In other words, if you think that it is exclusively that, maybe in a lower social economic status that the child is not getting fed, that this is the only area that could cause this, then I would tell you that you're wrong. There's been cases where mom doesn't want to have a fat baby. So what does she do? She tells the care provider, no, my baby can only have 2 bottles for the entire day. There have been cases reported where a mother, rather than giving them the milk, that they have given them, skinny, whatever it is. It's the formulas that Slim Fast. Thank you. Okay, so that a mother might be giving the child Slim Fast, and so they're not getting the proper nutrients that they need for their development. So this might cause lethargy. So if a baby is very lethargic, we want to look at, is it related to nutrition or is it related to another developmental issue? So it also impairs the gross and fine motor skills, because a lot of times if a child is not getting the proper nutrition, they are very lethargic, and so they don't have that time to really practice, to use those fine motor skills. And they don't have the energy to start lifting their legs up and sucking their toes and all of those other wonderful things that they do. So all of this, when we talk about nutrition, is very, very important to the development. And we have to be able to understand how it's related to the development. It's not only related to the physical, but it's also related to the cognitive. When it's related to the cognitive, it goes right back to being related to the physical development. On the other side of this coin, too, is that we look at the issues now that's a big campaign of Michelle Obama, is childhood obesity. And we know that in the United States that it has been a big issue, but it's not just in the United States. Now it really is a exploration of an epidemic, of a global epidemic. I want to point out a few interesting characteristics about this later on, as far as associated to culture, which we also need to keep everything in a cultural context too. So if you look here to the right hand side, you can see this nice little bar graph, and it shows that really since about 1971 through 74 to 2007, 2008, we have tripled in the number of obese children. Now, in taking that into context, Hollywood sometimes doesn't have the best view of exactly what's going on in the real world. And so when Michelle Obama comes out with these, people have to exercise more, people need to get out, people need to, buy better foods, make better food choices. Well, the reality of the situation is we don't have our entire population that lives high above standards and has access to all great foods and has access to the local gym and has access to phenomenal parks and has access to, even cooks and chefs that can tell us that we need this, this, and this in our diet. And so a lot of this comes down to really understanding, what populations are out there that we need to help and we need to support, and what those disconnects are. So we really have to look at it on a much more global and a realistic way of just saying, well, families need to do a better job of going out and having better food choices and exercising. It's much bigger than just that. So we have to look at what's the availability. And I know I posted in the think tank this week a really, really good YouTube that talks about exactly what's going on. So interesting that there's a lot of really fresh food markets in higher affluent neighborhoods, and then we don't have those in maybe areas that aren't quite as affluent or really kind of are at the poverty line. And so we have to look at education. A mother that is very young maybe does not have the education to understand what nutrition is. And that could be even a mother that's older too. So do they have the education to understand the nutrition? And what kind of support can we give the family too to help them to understand what they can do? If a mother doesn't feel safe sending their child out into a neighborhood, and there's many neighborhoods that are not safe for children to go out into, then what can a mom do? You know, can they maybe, if they do have which many households, regardless of income, do have a TV, or they do have a Wii, or they have these different video games, how about doing, a session of exercise, in front of the TV? Or doing something with the child. And so really working with the families to kind of understand how they can do things together within their context. What are some reasons behind this epidemic? So let's talk a little bit about the deeper issue of this. So think, what can be some influencing factors that we look at from 1971? What's happened in our society since 1971? One, we have more fast food restaurants. Literally, you cannot walk a block without, or in a city at least, without going into a Starbucks, without going into a McDonald's. There's probably a Burger King right around the corner, and blah, 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 blah. All of these different fast foods that really kind of inundate us nowadays. What else do we have? We have super cheap processed foods. You can go into a grocery store and you can buy a carton of milk for $3.99, or you can buy 4 gallons of POG for 99 cents a piece. So sometimes parents look at that, what am I getting more bang for my buck? Now we're inundated with all of this, the media and advertising. If you want to spend just 10 cents more, you can supersize that. Well, it's a good deal. I would be dumb not to. But we don't think, you know what, I don't need that, so why would I even spend 10 more cents? So, we're inundated with a lot of these choices that kind of make things look really good to us. Then we also have the poverty, households at or just below the poverty level, the working poor. We have an increase in that population. And then we also have a distrust in society, whereas when I grew up, literally, mom sent us out right after lunch, and, there was never any worry. I was in the neighborhood, and I would be home at dinner time. But we don't have that a lot anymore. So, there's a changing society, and we have to recognize that, too, that these are all factors that are associated to childhood obesity. So really exploring the epidemic size globally is that it is different in developing worlds as far as developed worlds. In developed worlds, really we look at the focus from children or from low-income families, and in the United States it's highest among Latino and African American children. I do want to point one thing out, because I think it is important to note from the different cultures. Amongst the Latino and African American children, these are the most non-discriminating group of children. In other words, it doesn't matter to them as much as in other cultures that a child is thin or if a child is overweight. So I think that is something important to point out too. Another thing that I want to point out here too is that we also have to keep it in the cultural context. There are some cultures that where a child who is a little bit more overweight, or even a person for that matter, that is looked at as a sign of wealth because they have the availability to feed themselves very well. So just keep some of these things in a cultural context too. So let's look at what are some factors promoting obesity. So the primary culprit is the lack of physical activity, the internet and TV. The researchers show that the time spent watching TV predicts obesity. Now remember that this is not a blanket for everybody. We do have kids that are overweight as they grow up, and I can tell you this from my experience with my daughter. And then all of a sudden puberty hits, and she could not eat enough food to keep her weight normal. She grew up and she grew in. On the other side of that, we have where children grow up very, very thin, and then they hit puberty, and then all of a sudden the weight starts coming on very easily for them. So just keep it in context. There are many different factors, and every case is a little bit different. So obesity, when we look at obesity in the developed world, I already went over that one. Then we also look at oversized portions of food too. You know, we have the supersize now, and you know, McDonald's is trying to get a little bit better. I see they have the cuties, or what is it, the halos out there for the kids where they can have an orange with their meal, and some of their portions are getting smaller. But, you know, we have these very large serving sizes. I don't know if you go into a Chili's and you get a hamburger, it's like a hamburger for an entire family. And so we also have to look at the caloric intake. The norm for let's say even an adult that is maybe just trying to maintain a weight is anywhere from, I think it's like 2,000 to 2,600 calories a day. I think it's a little bit more for men, but then when we look at these different standards too, we have to factor in, you know, how much exercise is going on, you know, what is the makeup, what are the genetics of the person, and so, you know, and everybody does have a different metabolism rate. Some people just are naturally slower, while others are just naturally faster too. So then we look at the caloric content, and we also look at the negative attitudes and the stereotypes. Now here's the very interesting thing about this, is that we would hope that individuals who maybe could help the children would be there to help them. Say, for instance, the gym teachers. But really what has been shown is that in studies show that gym teachers display really negative attitudes towards obese children. And they label them as slow and clumsy. And a lot of times they will give them less help than they do for, say, that shining star, up-and-coming athlete. And so really when a child needs that extension of help, they're not getting it, and they're getting just the opposite. So, you know, these are also things that we need to recognize, especially for those that are going into social work or going into helping out different families too. All right, so now that we have covered some of the issues regarding the influences on development, let's start breaking that down a little bit more. So we're going to start looking at the pre-operations and the concrete operations. And so here you can just kind of read through the different sections of what is encompassed in each one of these different stages. The pre-operations is from about the age of 2 to 7, and then concrete operations is about from the age of 8 to 12. So now what happens is when we talk about pre-operational stage, we're looking at, you know, what does that child believe and what are they seeing and knowing as true in the world. And so a lot of times this is 2 to 7 where, you know, Barbie doll is their best friend or their teddy bear has a name. And so teddy bear comes to life and they talk to their teddy bear, they talk to their baby just like the baby is alive. So it takes on real humanistic characteristics. And so we look at how things maybe in their immediate proximity appear live. And so we have to understand that this is sometimes has to do with imaginary play, but this is what they are interpreting. And then as they move from more pre-operational stages, they move into the concrete operational stages where they have a realistic understanding of the world. And so they're starting to become on the same wavelength as adults, where they can reason and they start to form more concrete decisions or problem-solving skills. And so but they cannot think abstractly in a scientific way yet. So they're getting there, they're developing. So that tree, again, is growing. All right, so let's look at a little bit more of this pre-operational stage and the characteristics. So a lot of times you can think of this kind of maybe as the stage where things are still kind of magical and non-abstract yet. So the characteristics include that a child has the inability to step back from his immediate perception and think conceptually. So in other words, if a bear has a personality and a bear is alive and they've seen a bear on TV, then their teddy bear should hold those same characteristics. And so when we look at how they think, it's more qualitatively. In other words, they don't have the ability to gauge and to compare things. If something is wrong, let's say if a mom maybe has to do something that is against a law, where the light says don't walk, and the mom sees a older lady start to walk out into the street, she doesn't recognize the signal or doesn't look at the signal. So the mom walks out in the street to hold the old lady back to make sure that she's safe. And what a child will say to that is, "Mom, you broke the law. The light said don't walk." And so they're not able yet to articulate the kind of comparison or the abstract thinking of, well, that lady could have gotten killed or could have died. They see the immediacy of, this was the law, you shouldn't have done that, and so therefore you were wrong. And children will never let you forget those sort of things that they see you doing. Child cannot reason logically, just like we just talked about with that example, and young children understand only what they can see. In other words, it's hard for them to conceptualize something or stories that you might tell them about. So they want to be able to see. They want evidence. They want to be able to understand, hold, know, and experience what you're telling them. So let's look at some of how we assess these different pre-operational thoughts. So how do we know this is going on? Well, what we do is there's a number of different ways that we can gauge this. One is that Piaget uses different tasks, such as conservation. So our knowledge, and what this has to do with is our knowledge that the amount of a given substance remains the same despite the changes in shapes or form. And pre-operational children do not understand the law of conservation or the concept of reversibility. So children centered on what they can see only. And so let's kind of look at some of those examples, because these I think are really kind of cool to look at. So what we have here is a chart, and it's got the pennies lined up, and they all are one right below another, and there's two different sets of them. And then when they take the pennies and they move them out to be a little bit longer, and they ask the child which one has more pennies in it, the child will choose the one that looks longer, because if it's longer, then it must have more. Then they also looks at the two equal balls of clay, and so when they take one of those and they squeeze it and they make it look flat, and now it says, are the two amounts of clay the same? Then the child answers no, because one is big and a ball, and the other one is flat like a pancake. And then there's also the famous liquid test, where they take one short and stocky glass full of liquid and then one very tall one, and they pour the same amount of liquid, and they say which one has the most liquid, and then of course the child picks the tall glass. And then here you can see the last one here that's talking about matter, and the two identical sugar cubes, and one dissolves, and then they ask, is there now the same amount of sugar? And the child will say no because they can't see the sugar that has dissolved into the cup of water. And so this is how they start making their judgments on what's going on. So everything centers basically on what they can see and what they know. If it's longer or taller or bigger or not there, then something is going on with that. So let's look at a different exercise that the pre-operational thinking also uses to gauge this. Children also have trouble grasping these concepts. Class inclusion. And what this is understanding that a general category can be encompassed with several subordinate elements. So let's say if, and a lot of times you might think of this as how they learn that 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4 is equal to 1 whole, and which is equal to a half and a half. So they can't start to grasp that, because if you have 4 little 1/4 and one whole and 2 halves, and you ask the child which one is the longest, then they would, or which one has the most length, then they would choose the 4. And so they start looking at things as more concrete. In other words, they can't start to form these things together. The next one is seriation, is the ability to put things in order according to a principle such as size. And here you have a little girl who has the sticks in front of her, and if you were ask her to put these into order as far as size, she might just use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or she might try to grab some of the longer ones, but she might not be able to compare 3 and 4 and 1 as being totally different. And it might also have to do with how close it is to her. If it's closer to her and it looks bigger, so she might select that one. One of the other things that are going on at this stage is the children have the inability to grasp identity consistency. And so a lot of you might have experienced this, that as you put on a Halloween costume, and even though it's mom, and maybe in makeup, or dad who has a mask on, or an aunt or an uncle, and then all of a sudden, even though the hands are the same, maybe the child can identify the shoes or identify the dress, the fact that there's a mask or that the child can't identify specifically who that person is, then the child becomes very scared and probably shouts or cries, and then they are very, very surprised once you take the mask off that it is actually the same person. In with this stage 2, we look at how they move into the concrete operational stage. And this is really the transition from the pre-operational to the concrete operational stage. And what is happening here is that by the age of 8, they are firmly in this stage, and they understand conservation, they understand identity and consistency, and they look beyond immediate appearances. A couple of the other things that I want to talk about back at the first stage and kind of going into this stage is that we have animism, artificialism, and egocentrism. Now, we talked about already a little bit about the animism, is that they believe that inanimate objects are alive. So it's really how they're starting to judge things. And so as we move into more concrete operational, then they understand that, even though their nice little warm fuzzy teddy bear does provide a lot of comfort, that it is really just a teddy bear and that it's not alive. And so then we also look at the artificialism, where they start moving from believing that humans make everything to understanding that it is a process in the environment, it's a process in nature, and things are happening. So it might be the fact that a child might say at the age of maybe 3 or 4, who made the trees? And so a parent might say, well, if you're religious, parent might say, well, God made the trees. And then the child might say, well, who is God? Who is this person? I want to speak to them, and I want to see how they make the trees. And so they start associating that everything is made. It might even be, something that if a parent bought a Barbie doll and they brought it home and they're sharing it with the child, then a child might say, you know, my mom made this Barbie doll, or my dad, you know, my dad made this Barbie doll for me. And so they don't understand really how things are made, just kind of that, you know, mom gave it to them or dad gave it to them, and that so mom or dad must have been the ones responsible for making it. And they start moving from a more egocentric way of being in the world, where everything is me, 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 to looking at maybe a little barter system that, you know what, maybe if I do share this with my friend, then they'll share their stuff with me. If I share my paper, my colorful paper, then they'll share all of their crayons with me. So they're moving more in from the egocentric, which would say, you know, I want all the crayons and paper, to really kind of starting to barter and starting to realize that they have an input in the world, and that it's not just about taking, it's about give and take. So now we're going to move from this stage and look at a little bit more of the concrete operational stage. And again, this is where they start to realize that if you take 4 1/4 little logs and you take a 1 whole log and you put them together, that they are actually the same length and they equal the same thing. So, you know, we start to see those math operations coming into play here, and understanding, again, that the quality of liquid, whether it's in a short and stocky cup or a very tall one, that it is the same amount of liquid in both of them. So what we have to remember here is that these are all parameters. So this is really kind of, we've been looking at Piaget's different stages. So what do you think? Should the pre-operational and concrete operational stages be classified as different stages? Because haven't we really talked about how these skills develop gradually? You know, and it's up to you to decide, well, you know, maybe they need to have a little bit more of a fuzzier, you know, parameters on it, or it's just the fact that this kind of gives us a general outline. But, you know, all of these different stages really kind of help us understand that maybe at about the age of 4 or 5, that we should see them picking up a pencil and, you know, doing something with that. And so it just gives us some parameters. So I want to just kind of point out a couple of FYIs on the criticism of Piaget's theories. Is that one, that he overstated egocentric thinking. In other words, we do have children at very young age, and especially dependent on culture. One thing that Piaget never really took into consideration was that culture was very important, and the socialization and verbalization was very important. So that culture influence has that influences on the timing of learning of certain tasks. So again, we see here that that he really didn't take into the factor in that culture was very important. So, you know, that might be something else that when you do look at Piaget's theory that you have to understand, is that he was not really culture focused. And so we know in different cultures, even with the egocentrism of children, that there's a lot of cultures that right from day one, you know, really kind of instill that it's not about the individual, it's not about what you can get, you need to share with your other friends. I know in the Japanese culture, when I was stationed in Okinawa, when parents would discipline their children, they wouldn't say, such as what we might hear in the United States, they wouldn't say, you hit your friend on the head. That's not acceptable. You had bad behavior. Or, you know, people don't like that. Putting it back on the individual. In Okinawa, what a parent would tell the child was, oh, you hit your friend. You hurt your friend. You don't want to hurt your friend, do you? You need to make up with your friend, and you need to make that better with your friend, because we don't want to hurt people. And so it's more of about a we connection. It's not about people are going to look at you and say you have bad behavior. It's about you hurt your friend, and you need to do something about hurting your friend. So this is just a little bit of a different look of Piaget's theory. So we're going to go into looking at Lev Vygotsky and the different views of the cognitive growth. I will tell you that I am a huge Lev Vygotsky fan, because I love the way that he teaches, and that there's just this element of allowing kids to be kids, and do what they need to do to get to their stages of growth and to experience the world. So what Lev Vygotsky looked at was that the human interaction promoted learning and cognitive growth. He was big into the social and cultural context, and what he believed was that it was through the helping of children to get to an independence was through a collaborative type of learning. And so when we talk about the proximal zone of proximal development, or kind of better known in the learning or education world as the ZPD, is that it's moving from a level of independence to what they can do for themselves to what they need help with. In other words, it really is starts to look at, okay, if they're going to learn this task and they already know this, then I only need to teach them this much. So what it looks at is, how can we scaffold to get that child to the area of learning or to the level of learning that they have the potential to grow to. And so that's done through scaffolding. And, and scaffolding it's a great big huge long theory, and I'm going to break it down into 3 sentences for you. I do one, we do one, and you do one. So in other words, it is the educator showing the child how things are done, then them creating something together, and then giving the reins to the child to reflect back to the educator that they know how to do that. So it's getting them to that sense of independence to be able to do a specific task themselves. So as we go on and we look at effective scaffolding, it can be the first and foremost to foster that secure attachment. So we know that we have to have that interaction and that positive development. So to be able to break larger cognitive skills into smaller, more manageable steps. So that might mean if a child has to sort out 100 different things, and it might be little colored animals or little colored figures, and it might be 2-legged animals and 4-legged animals. So what the educator might do is just take a handful of those and say, okay, sort these by colors. Don't worry about how many legs they have. Don't worry if they come from the farm or if they come from the forest. Just sort them by colors. And so they do that step, and then they might do the next step, and then the end result would be to tell the child, here are 100 different figures. Sort them by color, then sort them by if they have 4 legs, and then sort them by if they come from the forest or if they live on a farm. So then when we talk about being able to do these steps, another important area is that when the child does make a mistake, is that they have non-threatening feedback. Instead of saying you did it wrong, then an educator might take that little handful of things and say, okay, this is very good. This is a very good attempt. Now let's look back again at what we talked about, what was the parameters. So if the parameters are to sort them by color, are they all by color? And so questioning the child to re-evaluate what they have done and giving them the permission and the independence to change their way of thinking or to change what they have done. So continuing to help the child until they have mastered the concept and then move on. So to a level of mastery. And this is also very important too, because if they don't get it to the level of mastery, then whatever level they do take it to, they might think that that is the correct level. So it might just be, again, through practice and showing them many different ways. And then to set an overall framework for the learning task and build in motivation. So, we're going to be talking a little bit about how to motivate children to get them to an intrinsic motivation, which is what we want to do, and through maybe not using so many of those little trinkets and toys and candy, which a lot of schools will give out candy if children do things right. And this is a really, really bad way of rewarding children. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can motivate them to get them to want to succeed, because it's an intrinsic motivation. And So a little bit of the differences that we talked about before with Lev Vygotsky is that one of the big differences is that Piaget did not take into consideration social or cultural context. And he also, really literally, Piaget thought that self-talk was not needed for growth. And Lev Vygotsky was huge on self-talk. And we're going to talk about that a little bit down the road here too. But Lev Vygotsky basically thought that children needed to be able to talk because talking was part of their growth. It was part of being able to reason out concepts, and it was really starting to regulate themselves too. If children were able to talk about maybe things if they were doing dress up or whatever, and other children were there, then they would be bouncing context off of the other children too. And so they would be gauging their appropriate behavior accordingly. Okay, so we are going to go on and we are going to look at the cognitive development through information processing perspective. Now this is our last theory that we're going to look at. And so this is, again, for a more cognitive development way of thinking about how people think. So this one might be, rather than looking at it in a more qualitative or holistic way, is that we're starting to look at it more of, I guess, a mechanics sort of way, if you will. So what this does is it looks at specific skills such as the development of memory, concentration, and the ability to inhibit and control our own actions. And this is part of the mental growth occurs gradually, not in stages. So again, a move away from Piaget's theory. And so it attempts to decide the processing steps involved in attempts to decode the processing steps involved in thinking, and explores the development of memory and executive functions. Now, if we think of the executive functions, basically what this is the cognitive control. So it's the working memory, how we get things into our brain. It's reasoning them out, and then looking at, oh my gosh, that didn't work. How am I going to be flexible of maybe overcoming that? So task flexibility, problem solving, and then planning of the task. You know, a lot of times educators will tell students, and this is very good as far as it starts to develop metacognitive skills, and it also starts to develop all of these executive functions, is that an educator will tell students, get out the necessary things you are going to need for the next lesson. So if the next lesson is history and they're going to be drawing a picture of a famous figure in history, then they might have to get out their book, they might have to get out a piece of paper, and they might have to get out their colored pencils. And so all of this is starting to help them to develop these different skills that they're going to need through their executive system. And so, you know, one of the things that I'm a huge supporter of, that we love to go to, are all these workshops at Home Depot. And so, you know, the kids have to get out the tools they need. They already have these little kits. I think I have every single kit ever made by Home Depot. But they get out the little kits. There's stickers that are involved. They have to use their hammer. There's little nails. And then they build something. And so all of these things, even at a very young age, are developing all of these different functions. So it's very, very important that they engage in these type of activities. So, and from this particular theory, when we look at the information processing, what we look at these younger ages is that they have a working memory, and this holds about 7 bits of information. It keeps the information in awareness, and then either we process the information or discard it. Was that important to us, or that we don't need it? So the executive processor allows us to focus on important materials to prepare for permanent storage. And so it might even be the steps of putting this little wooden car together at Home Depot. And so they're starting to focus on the different steps. The next time they go to one of these workshops and build a car, then they're like, okay, yeah, do not hammer the wheels together first. You have to hammer those together last. And then They put these into the memory bin, which the capacity to expands between about the ages of 2 to 7, and it allows for new understanding around the ages of 17 or 7 or 8, where they move into the concrete operations. Okay, we're going to move on here to information processing and looking at the executive function. And this happens in the frontal lobe. This is the ability for us to inhibit or to respond and to plan and direct our thinking. So how do we do this? How are kids able to direct their own thinking? Do we have to tell them everything? No, because they're already starting to add intellect, aren't they? And so they do this by either rehearsing, selective attention, or inhibition. And so when we talk about rehearsal, a lot of times this might be being able to be in a play at school. So even when they're doing these plays and they're cute for us adults to go and watch, these are actually helping their cognitive development because they have to rehearse their lines. It can be a spelling bee. It can be learning their spelling words. So all of these things are helping their cognition. The second one is selective attention, and this can be completing a special task. In other words, like making that model car. So you see as they grow, a lot of times they start picking out hobbies or things that they really enjoy doing, and they're able to focus on them more. If you tell your child, okay, it's time to do homework, then they sit down and they might focus on that one page of homework. So they're able to regulate themselves. And this kind of even goes into the inhibition and being able to regulate themselves. We think of all of these fun little games that we do with kids, and we don't think of them as being cognitive development strategies. Well, what about Simon Says? So the ability for a child to maybe look at themselves and regulate themselves and to not just do what they want, this is a wonderful, wonderful game is Simon Says. Because we see that when kids are probably at about the age of 2 or even, just learned how to walk, and we say, Simon says, take a step forward. And then the next one is run to me. Then you'll see all the little kids run right to you. And all the older kids, maybe around the age of 4, 5, 6, they're still standing there because they get it. They're able to start regulating themselves, and they're able to start saying, oh, wait. I need to stop until this actual word is said. So, even through these different games that we do, we can see how they're processing information. So, it's very, very interesting to watch and to understand this process now, isn't it? So, let's look at a little bit of, let's see. We're going to go on to look at now, and I just talked about inhibition. So sometimes this does not happen at the rate that parents or teachers want. And this is a really, really important section for me because I think it's really important, and I did a lot of work with kids that were diagnosed with attention deficit or hyperactivity. And quite honestly, I think there's a lot more going on, and I hope to share that with you. So this is going to be kind of our last little part of looking at the cognitive development, looking at ADD and ADHD. So here's just going into a little bit of signs and symptoms of how a child might be diagnosed, or even an adult with ADD or ADHD. So it's excessive restlessness, easily distracted, difficulty focusing, usually diagnosed in elementary school, most often diagnosed in boys, more often diagnosed in the United States. So remember what we talked about in the very first lesson was talking about the pruning. And a lot of times now they're starting to associate maybe the pruning not happening to the full extent, and that being associated with ADD or ADHD. Regardless, it's a big issue because a lot of educators feel that it's a big issue, and a lot of parents feel it's a big issue. Now, the one thing that I do want to talk about is that there are several things that are very important first off is the fact that a child that has ADD or ADHD should not be made to feel embarrassed. This is not something that they did wrong or that they made wrong in the world. This is who they are, and it's part of them. And in some ways, the biggest thing is that we try to conform these kids to fit into normal, and I do that with quotation marks, because if anybody can define normal to me, please have at it. I have yet to find out exactly what normal is. So we have these normal classrooms, and we try to make these kids fit into these classrooms. So a lot of times these kids start to feel like there's something wrong with them. And in reality, there is nothing really wrong with them. They're processing through something that is part of them. And in many cases, they can still do a lot of things if we, as educators, can figure out how to support their needs. Now, so a lot of times it's the schools that want to make the child fit the environment. And now what we're looking at, and I've put up some information, and I've talked about a few different people, and I really want to talk to any of the parents out there who maybe kids have been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD, and there's a wonderful, I think he's a psychiatrist and a pediatrician or something anyway, Dr. Hallowell, and he has, you can either go to his page or you can download his video. That is awesome. It's called ADD Goes to School. He himself has ADD, so he understands the entire process, but he looks at how classrooms can be conformed to be able to support children who have ADD or ADHD as part of their being. And so I will tell you honestly, with my own story, is that I grew up going to doctors because I was very hyperactive, didn't like to sit still, and quite honestly, I am still that way. For many of you that know me, I'm kind of a perpetual person, and I start at about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I don't end until about 10 or 11 at night. But I've learned how to manage the the hyperactivity, and I've learned how to use it to my advantage. In school, I will tell you honestly, I was that kid that sat in the back of the room, that fidgeted, that couldn't stand sitting in a chair for more than 15 minutes, and so education was not fun for me. And I honestly did not even do very well in elementary school, in middle school, and in high school. It was not until I was given the ability to manage my own education that I started to flourish. In other words, I didn't have to sit in the classroom. I could do my own studying on my own time. I could pick my own things. And so once I had control of that, and I was able to study, and I was able to manage my education myself, then I began to flourish. So if you want to talk about a late bloomer, and you want to have a story of where people say, oh my goodness, if they don't do well in high school, that's not they're not going to go anywhere in life, then you can tell people that you know me, and here's the story. Really, literally, I used to say C's make degrees, and that's about all I could hope for up through high school. In my bachelor's degree, I was about a B+. In my master's degree, I was about a B+. And in my doctorate's degree, I was an A+ with all high honors. So, when people talk about late bloomers and they talk about kids with ADD and ADHD, sometimes, it's a little bit humbling to know that these kids really, really can go on to flourish, because I know it, I live it, and so it's a wonderful thing to understand that when parents are told that their children are ADD or ADHD, that it's a part of them, it's manageable, it's a process, and that it will just become something that they will have to manage and learn how to manage, just like anything else. If a child maybe had to be in a wheelchair, or if a child has to, I don't know, if they have some other sort of disorder, or if they have some other physical disability. We learn how to manage these things. They're a part of a children. They're not something to be embarrassed about. It just is what it is, and we plunge forward. So I just wanted to share that with you a little bit. And then we're going to go on. We're going to look at the different treatments. And I need some water here, excuse me. And we look at the standard treatments of the psychoactive stimulant medications, which a lot of us know is the most popular one is Ritalin. And so it's best used with reinforcement of appropriate behavior. And so when we say appropriate, you know, I really think that we need to change some of this wording so we can say that we use it with reinforcement with behavior that supports positive learning for that child. In other words, if we can use the psychoactive drugs, and there's a lot of parents that are like, no way, not going to use it. But what these drugs do, or what they attempt to do, is kind of take the edge off so that the child is able to focus more, so that they are able to incorporate some of these management strategies. It is not a cure. And so any, doctor that says they just need to take this drug, that's all they need to do, that is not a cure, and there's many other things that need to be done, and the child needs to learn management of their different, whatever it is, their traits and characteristics are, of how to manage them. So I already talked a little bit about fostering the best person, in other words, the environmental fit, and to provide a non-distracting environment that demands selective attention. In other words, if you know your child has a little bit of an attention deficit disorder, then when they do their homework, they should be in a quiet room, they shouldn't have a lot of distractions, and they should have the time to be able to focus. If they need to get up and walk around, then give them the time to get up and walk around. If it takes them an hour to do homework that maybe takes another child a half hour, that's fine. They're starting to regulate, and they will learn how to focus. If you make it a criteria, you must finish this in a half hour, you will instill more anxiety on that child that they don't need. All right, so there was one more that I wanted to talk about. Okay, so don't read this slide yet. I wanted to talk about the interventions for ADD and ADHD. One is to reduce distractions. Allow special time for exercise. These kids, if they have if they're hyperactive, they've got to release that energy. They've got to have the ability to release that energy. Give the child special time and help with activities that demand several steps. In other words, don't be demanding, but allow them the time that they need to maybe focus on a step, get up and walk around. Focus on a step, get up and walk around. Minimize the need to multitask. Just like I talked about. Don't put all of their books. If they come home with a lot of different homework from maybe math and English, etc., don't put all those books on the desk. It's too much. It's too overwhelming. Take one book, one task at a time. Minimize the need to multitask. Consider psychoactive stimulant medication. Talk to your doctor. Talk to a psychologist, a child psychologist, somebody who is able to give you the best information on what needs to be done. Teachers and school counselors do not make diagnoses. Make that very, very clear. A teacher does not make a diagnosis. Okay, make sure that you use the proper professionals. Avoid power assertion. Do not define your child as a bad kid. ADD and ADHD is a part of them. It's who they are. Your personality is a part of you. It's part of who you are. Things might change. They might grow up not to be have ADD or ADHD, but they might have that even as in their adult life. It's a part of them. They learn how to manage, just like everything else. They learn how to manage. Interesting. Other things that can help with ADD and ADHD is the child knowing their triggers. Is also diet. Relaxation techniques. They're using a meditation, and they're also using guided imagery for children with ADD and ADHD. And monitoring through sharing. Ask the child, hey, did anything, happen today that you thought you managed really well? Let them tell you about their success stories. Because it is the worst thing for a parent to go to school and then ask the teacher, well, how'd the day go? And you know what? Things could have gone right. And so instead of the teacher saying, oh, yes, we did have a breakthrough at math, he did really well or she did really well, sat through the lesson and did the homework. All of a sudden, the parent hears, oh, yeah, another bad day, got up in the middle of storybook reading, walked around, blah, blah, blah. Well, we need to know what the child is doing right. And the child needs to understand that they are going to have successes and there's things that they can work on, just like any other child. Knowing their triggers. I worked with a young boy. I went to school with him and we went into the classes. When he would get a trigger, which was generally that he had been sitting in his desk too long and things became confusing to him, was that he was all of a sudden went from 0 to 100. So we started recognizing those triggers. And his first trigger was that his leg would start shaking. And he never even articulated that. This boy was 12 years old. He never really even articulated that to being part of his ADD. And so once we found out, his trigger, he actually had a physical trigger, which a lot of kids don't, was that he was allowed to, and working with the teachers, he was allowed to get up and go to this back part of the room where they had a little couch, and he could sit there for a second and he would do some breathing techniques. And once he felt that, he was good, he would come back to his seat. And so we learned to manage different areas of his ADD. So just to, tell some of you parents out there about these things, that that ADD and ADHD is not quite as scary as sometimes teachers make it out to be, and educators and school counselors and principals. And a lot of times it's the fact that they don't want to change their environment for the child. Well, you pay for the education, and that's exactly what should be going on, is the environment should fit the child. The child should not have to fit the environment all the time. Again, I want to promote the idea that if you do have a child that is diagnosed, is to go out and to educate yourself. The Misunderstood Minds video is excellent, and also the all of the DVDs or the things that you can buy, the downloads from Dr. Hallowell's site, is very enlightening too, because he's a big supporter of the fact that we need to change education to fit the child, not change the child to fit education. And obviously, as you can tell, so am I. So let's look at a little bit of developing speech and Lev Vygotsky. This is our last area here, and we will be done with this section. So, Vygotsky. So looking at language, is that Lev Vygotsky believed that language was a huge part of learning, or the inner speech, how either children talk to themselves, whether it be out loud or whether it be inner speech. So he believed that a lot of times children made decisions on, what they said. So whether they're playing with other kids doing dress up, oh, that looks really nice. Or if they yelled at another child and the other child kind of gave them a look like, why are you yelling at me? That speech meant something. That speech in a loud tone meant, my friends don't like that. I need a softer tone with my friends. So really, he believed that speech was a huge part of the development. I'm losing my voice here. Sorry. So let's look at, go into the speech. It's really by about age 2. Children use their inner speech to start monitoring themselves, and we have to also remember this in the social and the cultural context, because Lev Vygotsky believed that there was a lot going on in the cultural context and the social context. So by age 2, that they begin to put the words together. And we look at their first ability to put words together, and it's we look at the phonemes, or phonemes, whichever you want to say, and the individual words or sounds of a language. In other words, they start to say, k, cat, d, dog, and then they move into morphemes, which are the basic meaning of units of the language. So it's coded by the mean or length or the utterance. So what you might hear in this stage is that a child might say something, instead of saying like "Oh, please, mother, can I have some juice?" A child might just say, "Me juice, me want juice." So they're starting to put things together. So this is really what we can kind of expect. And then we look at the syntax, which is the system of grammatical rules in particular language. And so again, here's where culture comes into play. And so then they start to put things into the syntax, and they make mistakes in applying the rules of forming the sentences in the early stages of this development. So it might be something where they speak things backwards. You can see here it might be "me go home." And so they just say things a little bit differently. Regulation puts irregular past and present plurals into regular forms. In other words, I use my foots to walk, or I run to my mom, or I run to my dad. So there's a lot of things that are happening, and even when they make these mistakes, it's okay because they're developing. Their skills are developing into forming these sentences. And you know what? It's okay to correct children at this age, because as long as it's not in a demeaning sort of way. If a child says something like, instead of spaghetti, I remember my daughter, her big thing was busketty, which here we have babasketty. And so busketty, it sounds cute, but if she tells somebody when she's 21 that she wants a plate of biscotti, they might kind of look at her strange. So instead of saying you use that word incorrectly at the age of 2, we might say something like, just to utter back to them, "So you want a plate of spaghetti?" And a lot of times they don't even pick up on that, but they're hearing that in a correct form. And they will eventually get to the stage where they understand how to put their phonemes into the regular word utterance. Okay, so we're looking at that, and then the last one we're going to look at is the last slide, you guys. Yay! Good thing, because my voice is going. Is how they start to construct our personal past. So they're starting to gather up this autobiography memory. And so as we continue to develop their cognition through putting things together with the experience, they start to remember, oh, they liked the beach, they went to the beach. And so the recollection of events and experiences that make up one's life history. And so they're starting to scaffold this through past talk and conversation. Just like we looked at with Lev Vygotsky. This is why these conversations are so important. When mom says, "Get the beach towels," that means we're going to the beach. Oh my gosh, I remember last time we were going to the beach. And this is a lot of the inner talk that they're having with themselves is, oh my gosh, I love going to the beach. I can't wait to go. So it becomes more elaborate as children move from preschool to elementary and uses experience to connect with others. So it might be in, kindergarten or grade 1, we went to the beach. The beach is so fun. I made a sandcastle. And so they start sharing the experiences of their life. So really interesting how all this cognitive development happens. And I'm going to finish this one up now because my voice is going, and I will see you all in the next chapter. If you would like, you can take the little quick check quiz.